Patience is an important virtue to be had. People with dementia might not readily understand things, and maybe we'll have to repeat ourselves a number of times, but that's absolutely fine. That is how their brain works, and we are here to support them. So trying to be patient, not criticize, not be critical, not challenge them, and identifying things that might actually be very helpful to engage in a conversation rather than becoming a kind of interrogation itself. So having a cup of tea, looking at a photo album, looking at a book, trying to think about other activities of the day. So all of those kind of things could be very helpful, but it's important to validate that both parties involved in change. Maybe it's a carer, maybe it's the person with dementia, that they are going through a distress, and it's important to validate that.
My name's Sue Hinds. I'm a practitioner at Dementia Carers Count, and I've been hosting a range of Facebook Live carer clinics with Dr. Raja, who I will let introduce himself in a moment. But again, just to say, I'm sorry that we were late, quite unexpectedly, but quite apt, given that we are going to discuss the impact of changing routines. And certainly this has changed the routine for Dr. Raja and myself for this afternoon. And if it's changed a routine for you as well, perhaps that will be great opportunity to reflect on how change does impact on us and the effect that it can have, not just for a person with dementia, but for ourselves as well. So Dr. Raja, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raja. I'm an old age psychiatrist, and I specialize in dementia. One of my interests is the welfare and well-being of carers of people with dementia, because you guys do a fantastic amount of work to keep everything going, and National Health Service and Social Care should be, and we are truly indebted to you.
Thanks, Raja. I think you're completely right, aren't they? It's a fantastic and phenomenal amount of work that family carers do, and often based on trying to get a good routine going, trying to establish something that supports yourself as well as a person with dementia. And we're going to talk this afternoon about the changes to routine, the effect that can have on you and for the person you care for, and then maybe some of the things that you can do proactively to try and support if you think that there might be change occurring. And it's a great time of year to do this, because actually in the summer months there are often lots of changes that occur, and we'll be picking up on all of those in a little bit. But the same with other sessions that we've done with Raja. Raja, we've invited you at the start to give us a little case study, and if you were able to share one with us now, I think that would be perfect for setting up this session.
Absolutely. So I think it's the right time to talk about change as well, because summer brings in its own problems for elderly people with dementia. Obviously, there's the change to light and darkness spells, the amount of daylight that we get, that can be quite disorienting for people. But equally, it isn't uncommon, and I've come across this quite a few times in my clinical role, where elderly people may not be drinking adequately enough. The temperature goes up, they become dehydrated fairly quickly, and then that dehydration can then take them into an acute hospital. So there's one change already in terms of the dehydration having its impact. Then there's a change of being in hospital, being investigated. Then possibly there's an overlay of infection, because dehydration can lead to risk of urinary tract infection. And then there's that change which can then contribute to a delirium, disorientation, confusion, bit of stay, sometimes maybe a protracted stay in hospital, and then the idea of having to return back to home, or having to consider other options in terms of caring environment. So a simple thing which started as perhaps not being adequate in managing hydration during summer months can then lead to far-reaching consequences in terms of the circumstances in which the person with dementia finds themselves in. So change is a very huge thing, and we need to be aware of of different types of changes and see how best people with dementia and the carers can adapt to the changing circumstance.
Thank you. I think just the way you've explained that there, Raja, just shows how just one small thing just ricochets into huge amounts of different changes, doesn't it? It's not just one change and that's the event, and that would be difficult enough, but it causes this series of ongoing ripple effect events that can happen. And I think that's just really helpful and useful to think about when we do this session. As always, if anybody has any questions, please do put them in the chat. And if you want to remain anonymous, obviously you can message in anonymously as you have before. We'll try to get to all the questions or the comments as we go through this session. But if anything is outstanding at the end, because they do get busy, these sessions, then one of us will come back to you if need be at the end of the session or in the coming days. So please do get involved. Please put your messages in the chat. And we'd also, on this occasion, really encourage anybody to give us any comments that you might have around change that you've experienced and or changes that you know happen for you, and perhaps the things that you have found have helped you. Because we find, you know, I think as Raja, you said, carers, family carers are doing a phenomenal job of supporting people who they care for, and doing that phenomenal job. Everybody is learning on the job, aren't they? And you'll have found ways that have really helped you. And what we know from the sessions we do with carers, what one carer has found helps them often helps other carers. So we're certainly not the experts here, are we, Raja? What we really want to do is for people to put their ideas in the chat, and even if we don't get there, they'll be there for people to use in the future.
Yeah, true.
So just to set out what we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to look at the types of changes. Raja, you've kind of started to touch on it just now. We'll then look at some of the symptoms that you might see that somebody is having a change. Sometimes we're not aware that somebody has gone through a change that is difficult for them to cope with. It just seems a part of normal day life for us, but it could be a change that's, you know, if you see a symptom, you might think, oh, actually, make the connection to what had happened before. And then some of the things that proactively you can do to either try and prevent or mitigate for that symptom of having to change, those distress symptoms that might occur, but also if there is symptoms of distress, how you can support the person. Would you say that's fair, Dr. Raja?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously change is something that even people without dementia, without any mental health condition, may struggle at many times. And when the brain is stressed, when the circumstances are not conducive for brain to perform at its optimal best, then it can start to manifest in ways that makes things even more challenging. So I think it's important for us to recognize the common changes that happen during the course of life and how it then tends to exacerbate symptoms of dementia, and then for us to reflect on what could be done to try and mitigate against some of these changes.
Thank you. So I think, as you said in your sort of case presentation earlier, summer's a really busy time for people. There's multiple changes that go on. And you started with that idea of hydration as the weather turns hot. In the UK at the moment, we haven't just got a change to hot weather, have we? We've got a change to hot, then cold, then rainy, then hot, cold, then rainy. It's all over the place. So that change is constant, isn't it? But there are other situations that summer brings to people, as well as that temperature in weather, isn't it? And I wonder if we just could cover some of those other changes in routines that we know happen for carers in the summer.
I think it's interesting to look at dementia in some ways, because change can actually be the first thing that brings latent dementia to the fore. It may be that there is a change in terms of people retiring from work and then trying to fill their space with things, and then suddenly realizing that they're not able to learn new things or do new things, and that might be something that makes them aware of some of the difficulties that they have. It might be that they have family members who they have lost for whatever reason it is, how unfortunate the circumstance might be. and then the kind of comfort, the confidant that they had, they probably weren't having anymore, and then that might bring to fore some of the hidden cognitive symptoms of dementia, because that degree of support isn't there anymore. So those are very common situations where people might be diagnosed because whatever was happening, which wasn't very apparent, comes to the fore when these kind of changes happen. They may also be in the process of trying to maybe move to a different house, maybe downsizing, maybe considering retirement homes, and all of that comes with change in terms of routines, change in environment, trying to learn new gadgets, for example. And it was very surprising when I started out as a trainee that one of the common things that I had, maybe not now, maybe that much, is when people were starting to shift to having Sky um, um, services, television services, and the idea of trying to operate a new Sky box was a huge challenge, and that kind of brought to fore some of the cognitive problems that people had. So those kind of changes, but they could also be changes that people might experience in terms of for example, the bus route that they were quite familiar with isn't there anymore. We need to acknowledge as a charity that people are suffering as a result of cost of living crisis, and that has led to a lot of support services, essential services, even being removed. And losing those kind of very important things, losing a library, losing a bus route, can make things difficult for people, especially people with dementia, who might find that as the only way of trying to have that degree of socialization to keep their brains active. People might have had physical health reasons for becoming unable to drive, and that might stop them from going to meet their friends, or going to golf, or going to cafes, or local day center. All of those would make it extremely difficult for people with dementia. And we have come out of COVID, and one of the things that unfortunately happened during COVID is that the day centers were shut down, and then suddenly family carers had to bear the brunt of managing people with dementia 24/7, and that was a huge change, not just to the person with dementia who was already set to a particular routine and probably looking forward to that, and then for the carers to then face being burnt out from being constantly engaged in the caring role without much respite to get back to what they should experience as part of a very good quality relationship. So all of those kind of changes to changes to people, changes to environment, changes to circumstance, changes to access to social things would all make it very stressful for people with dementia and their carers.
That's a fabulous overview. Thank you, Raja. And I think it also links back to one of the very first Facebook Lives that we did, and we will find the link for people on YouTube for that particular one. But it was about some of the early signs and symptoms that perhaps somebody has a cognitive change that would require assessment by a memory assessment team. And in that was this idea that being able to cope with things that are changing as part of that diagnosis. You do mention the Sky remote. I would have problems learning a new Sky remote as well. So and that's why it's looking in the context of other things as well, isn't it? But you know, when you start to see changes, it may be that it's those changes to routine that flag up that somebody's having a problem. But there are also those changes routine that if somebody already has a diagnosis and has some cognitive difficulties already, that can really skew things. I like the idea you mentioned, the change to bus routines, because bus routines, if something changes like that, or our ability to drive, does impact on everyone. But if it's the one thing that is keeping somebody who has a dementia in touch with their cognitive skills and keeping them independent, and that sort of concept of if you don't use it, you lose it, and then it's taken away, it can have such a major impact. So I think all the things that you've listed around the weather, the time of day, the clocks changing, I think you mentioned that one earlier, bus routes, routines, day centres can impact everyone at whatever stage they're at, whether they're worried about whether they have a dementia or whether they do, but also really changes things for family carers as well.
Yeah.
When you mentioned day centres, I think, you know, you gave a really good description of what happened in COVID. But of course, this summer now, I'm sure carers are in a situation where day centres work in community settings. So the
Mm,
person has been used to be going to a weekly group or a weekly memory cafe, and suddenly it's summer holidays, it's school holidays, and that venue has to be taken over for play schemes,
yeah.
understandably taken over.
Yeah.
So there's another change, isn't there, where it's not
Yeah.
as a result of COVID and services stopping, but services having to take a temporary cease. And how do you explain that to somebody with dementia? Very difficult.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And that is when they start to there's when people with dementia start to struggle to conceptualize the change, then they might start to present with symptoms that might make us feel that they're having behavioral psychological symptoms of dementia, but they are primarily in the context of the change itself. And we'll have to discuss about some of the symptoms that make it quite difficult for care to be provided at home, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to then second move on to symptoms of changes that that you can see, the symptoms that might tell you that someone's experiencing a change and might make you want to think, oh, what's happening? What is it that's going on? But just to say, we haven't got many comments coming in at the moment around changes that people have experienced and how to do about it. But I think that may well be due to one of the massive changes this afternoon that we've had to change the time of the event. So if you aren't live and you are watching it at another time and you had questions or comments that you would ordinarily have made, then please do get in touch with us. We will put our support number and our email address into the chat for you. So just because you may not be watching this live at the moment, don't feel that we are not here to support you, because we have a team of practitioners who absolutely are, and we can give you the contact details for that. So I think the thing now is to think about, there was so many things to change his routine we thought could happen, and we've outlined some of them, probably not all of them by half, but it can be difficult to sometimes recognise the impact that has on a person with dementia or ourselves. So what sort of symptoms should a carer be looking out for?
I think it's important to understand that people with dementia may not be able to verbalize the challenges that they're facing because of the change, because they may not actually understand the change or maybe understand the consequences of the change. But there are things that people could look out for. If someone was to become quite restless, to become frustrated, or becoming irritable, all of us would be very familiar with where we're getting to at the midday and our glucose levels are going down, and we just start to get a bit restless, fidgety, and it goes with a common term these days of being hangry, as in hungry and angry together. So that degree of restlessness, frustration, irritability is something that can be quite common when people are experiencing a change. On the other hand, the change might have such a huge impact that the person with dementia might become so very withdrawn. They may not want to come out of their room or come out of their bed. They're not sleeping adequately enough at night time, so they start to look very tired and exhausted during the daytime. They're not eating very well. Their appetite has gone down. So it could be the other end in terms of becoming very withdrawn and not engaging that much. Equally, people with dementia, with the change, they could also go back into their into their childhood and spend more time talking about their childhood memories, or even having belief that they have to return home because their mom and dad are waiting for them, or that they might think that my son is not home yet, or I should go and pick up my son from home. So they might actually revert back to what their long-term memory is telling them, rather than what is happening in here and now. So you might end up with any of these scenarios where people are very agitated or disturbed, to becoming recluse or withdrawn, or to talk about something that has happened in the past, not necessarily in here and now. So those would all be symptoms of a change that is triggering a sense of uneasiness and discomfort in the person with dementia. It's a question of trying to understand what the change is and what could be done to mitigate against the change.
Thank you. And that's exactly, you know, there is no difference between a person with dementia and a person who hasn't got dementia, isn't it? We all have these responses were all triggered by change in some way. And I think you've really beautifully broken it down into these kind of hyper responses, which might be restlessness, frustration, irritability, and those more hypo dampened responses, which might be withdrawn, staying in bed, not sleeping adequately. We do a course, a 3-week course in our live online events that we have, and it's a bundle on stress and distress. So when somebody has a stress or they have a change or something that they're not sure how to deal with, it leads to distress function, and those sorts of things as you've listed. Our next run of that course does start on the 8th of September. We'll put the link in the chat in case anybody would like to book onto that. Really valuable course with some really expert practitioners who can support you through all of that. But I think what you've described is what some viewers will remember as being that fight or flight response. And that's what we're talking about, aren't we? This isn't a behavior that the person is doing on purpose to antagonize you or to irritate you or to upset you. It's a fight or flight chemical reaction to a situation. And sometimes we say we might freeze, we might fight, we might flight, we might flop, flap, so on. We all have different reactions to situations, don't we? And that's what's really heightened for a person with dementia, is some of those reactions that we see. It was interesting you said about glucose, and after dinner we have that glucose drop. You get that glucose drop, don't you, if you've been in a state of distress, if you've had your fight or flight, you get that glucose drop. So it doesn't happen just after lunchtime.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is the thing. So one stress leads to another stress, and before we know, things become more and more challenging and more difficult to manage, which is why it's very important to try and explore the reason for any sudden change of behavior, and then trying to establish what is the context of the change and what could be done to make the change much more manageable. I remember this conversation from my psychotherapy training days, where the context is about 2 hours. The first hour is the change itself, and in many situations that could never be avoided or mitigated against, but certainly it will evoke a response, which is the second arrow, and it's about what we do with the response and how we manage that actually makes things better.
Brilliantly leading us into part 3, Raja, about sort of 10 minutes to go, and it takes us into, well, what can we do about it? What can we do proactively, and what can we do sort of after an event? And there's a comment here, I'm going to read it out now, because hopefully we can just weave it into this discussion around proactive approaches, but also some reactive approaches. And Kirsty says the biggest issue for her is that she has her kids at home, and she can't get them to visit their nan because their nan makes them scared. She's making it hard for her to get to see her, as making routines in both households is totally wrong. Mum is getting really irritable, and we're seeing more incontinence. So it's having that ripple effect that you talked about right at the start. One change is causing lots of other changes, which I'm sure is quite distressing for everybody as well. I can't persuade my kids, even though they used to go to see her. Do you have any advice about helping children? Now, I know we're going to cover generally, but hopefully it will help for children. So can we go to those proactive things first that we can do if we know that there's going to be a change or things are different for the person with dementia?
I think it's always important to get the person with dementia to be involved in any change, and for them to be given enough information, time, in a way that they can understand. May not necessarily always be by talking to them. It may be using visual aids, or actually people might be more kind of touchy-feely, and it's about trying to engage all senses into trying to feed information as much as possible. And I think this is where I'm sure a lot of our audience would be very familiar with the concept of This Is Me document, which is a very well-structured document of trying to make anyone who looks after people with dementia understand the person behind the dementia, and that will help us to communicate people with dementia the change that they're going to face. And I think that is very important. If we were to start involving them at the point of change or before change, then that would be a very good that would be a very good approach. And if we were to try and apply it to the grandchildren situation, it may be trying to establish what kind of worries or what is the change itself in meeting grandchildren that makes the person with dementia become a bit put them at unease or discomfort. And it's trying to understand that and then trying to identify what could actually help to ease the situation. Maybe it's the idea of going home. Maybe it's just that the person is very embarrassed because they might feel that I am going to be incontinent and I don't want my grandchildren to see me in that particular state. And that might be the cause of anxiety that they experience. And equally, it might be for the children who may be used to very direct ways of communication or sequential communication, for them to understand that that people with dementia may not actually be relevant on the topic that they're talking about, and they may want to talk about something else, and they may digress. So it's about trying to understand what is it, or what are those individual elements of that particular interaction that makes it difficult for one person to understand or express themselves, and for the other person to follow. So I think anticipation and planning becomes a very important thing. Another important thing would be to look at our biological needs of people with dementia. Are they adequately hydrated? Have they had adequate amount of food? So that, because they might have to have better amount of concentration and support as they go through the chain. So that is very important. Is it the time that they are going to be awake, or is it their restful time? Because we don't really want people to be disturbed out of their routine when they're actually meant to be resting to go through whatever was the change event itself. To look at all physical things, such as, are they in pain? Are they eating adequately enough? Are they opening their bowels all right? Or do they have any problems with their water work? So all of those kind of individual elements. Are they taking their medications? Do they have problems with swallowing that's making it difficult in any way? So those kind of biological needs, and understanding them, anticipating them, and managing them as much as possible would be very helpful. And then there's a psychosocial element to it as well. For example, if we go with the idea of seeing grandchildren, where is this going to happen? Is it going to be in a familiar place, or is it going to be somewhere else outside? Is it that actually people love to go for a walk and meet other people, in which case it might actually make it sensible to go out for a walk? Because trying to get people with dementia to, say, for example, going to a restaurant or cafe and then meet people, and then to go through the etiquette of eating and drinking and having the conversation, it becomes difficult for children, it becomes difficult for people with dementia, and it might be very difficult. So trying to manage the environment and using a routine activity to engage into that particular event might be very helpful. We have also talked a lot about music being a very important factor that can mitigate against change. We've also talked about the importance of having reminiscence as a useful exercise to engage in communication, engage and then to communicate and use that as a way of managing change. So trying to be aware of what could be planned ahead, what would be the biological state of the person with dementia, where are we doing this change, and what are the psychosocial aspects to this change. I think trying to answer all of those individual facets would be very helpful in managing change.
Fantastic. And I'm really glad you summarised it at the end there, Raja, because I think there was so much information for people in there, so much useful information. So please, if you're watching this, it is a recording, or it's not a recording right now, but it will be a recording. So please feel free to go back to it, watch again, because I think the more you hear Dr. Raja, the more little different points that you'll bring out of it. And I think two of the key things that came through to me was communication. And whether that's with the person with dementia, whether it's family members, whether it's children, so that everybody understands what and can anticipate what the problems might be, or be able to understand when the problems arise. And the other one is so important, is a document such as This Is Me, because if you can do the This Is Me, as you said, you can anticipate which changes are likely to cause a person problems. Some changes won't cause someone any problems at all, but they might cause a different person problems, because we're all unique. We are all totally unique individuals, and so our experiences and the way we react to them is unique to ourselves. And I think is that phrase that's often quoted from Tom Kitwood: when you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia. And the same goes for the reactions to situations. So thank you for sort of going through those anticipatory, those biological and those psychosocial approach things that we need to consider. Then we need to sort of react, don't we, when it does happen, and that validation and that empathy, because it's not nice for any of us when we feel unperturbed or perturbed by change.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's important to verbalize the difficult emotion that a change causes, and to be open about it, and to validate it, to be empathetic to the person who is being distressed because of the change, offering an apology where it makes people understand that we do mean and we do take people seriously when. Especially about the distress that they are going through. Patience is an important virtue to be had. People with dementia might not readily understand things, and maybe we'll have to repeat ourselves a number of times, but that's absolutely fine. That is how their brain works, and we are here to support them. So trying to be patient, and not criticize, not be critical, not challenge them, and identifying things that might actually be very helpful to engage in a conversation, rather than becoming a kind of interrogation itself. So having a cup of tea, looking at a photo album, looking at a book, trying to think about other activities of the day. So all of those kind of things could be very helpful, but it's important to validate that both parties involved in change, maybe it's a carer, maybe it's the person with dementia, that they are going through a distress, and it's important to validate that at the very beginning. Sorry.
I'm going to take a leaf out of your book, and I'm going to just share a very quick story now. I was working with a carer a week or so ago called Paul, and he was finding that his wife was really challenged by change. And we talked about his responses, and we talked about validating. And even though he hadn't caused it, just saying, I'm sorry that this is causing you difficulty, or I'm sorry that you seem to be distressed. And his reaction initially was, well, that's not going to make any difference whatsoever. And a week later, when I saw him, he said it was so powerful. It was so powerful just to say, I'm sorry you feel that way, because it validated to that person that, it wasn't a don't be silly, you shouldn't feel like that, everything is fine, which kind of washes it under or brushes it under the carpet. It was validating that this is a real, and when someone tells us to calm down, the last thing we're going to do is calm down, isn't it? Whereas if we can say, I'm sorry you feel that way, it can be so powerful. Yet again, Raja, we have come towards the end. I'm just going to read one last comment before I do this closing remarks and signpost people to things that we have. But Carol does say, I'm finding it very confusing with my husband, as we have one doctor saying he has dementia and another saying it's depression and anxiety, and that's causing his confusion. She doesn't really know what to do. I think probably to go back to the doctor, is it, would you say?
Yeah, have a discussion with the GP, and then the GP will be able to identify a doctor who might be able to put to answer the questions more importantly. And we have to understand sometimes that dementia is an evolving diagnosis, and it might take weeks, months for things to become more apparent. And we also need to understand that sometimes dementia does coexist with conditions like depression or anxiety, and therefore they will have to be treated simultaneously, as much as trying to support the dementia side of things.
Thank you. And Carol, again, if you can go back to the recording of the Facebook Live that Dr. Raja and I did some weeks ago around signs and symptoms that somebody might have dementia, I'm hoping that might help you. But I'm really sorry that you're in this situation. It can be really confusing, and I understand that. So I'm sorry that's happening for you at the moment. So I'm going to bring us to the end of this session on the impact of changing routines. Just to say, our 2023 Carers Survey is currently live, and we'd really appreciate your input. It takes about 15 minutes to complete. In our 2022 survey, we discovered that 80% of those replied said that they'd reached crisis point at some point, which just goes to show, doesn't it, Raja, that how important it is for carers to take care of their own well-being through this whole thing.
Yes, it is a huge change for them, and it's important to be understanding of the change that they are going through themselves. But then life continues to carry on, and it's a question of trying to find time for themselves, to have people that they could talk with about the change that they're having in a comforting, in a supportive way, and also to be able to reflect on the change and the circumstances without being able to blame themselves for what was happening, because it's easy to fall trap whenever we are stressed. I think the first person that we tend to blame would be ourselves, and that's a huge guilt to carry. So it's important for carers to recognize that they are going through the change as much as the person with dementia, and to try and tap into support networks like what we offer, in terms of training, but also in terms of that degree of having those discussions with other people in the same situation, to try and support each other during the change process.
Yeah, support's so important from every avenue, and if we can be part of that through telephone or by online sessions or anything else, then we would just love to be so. So thank you, Raja. That brings us to the end of the session today. We'll be changing our routine for the next carer clinic, and I'll be joined by Elizabeth, who is a colleague of Dr. Raja. She's a clinical psychologist, and we'll be looking at the positive behaviour support plans which she works on to support a person with dementia and their family carer. Details of that we'll put in the chat, and just one other plea from me and from Dr. Raja: please show your support for carers and add your name to our open letter to the Minister of State for Social Care. We'll leave a link in the chat for you for that, and we encourage you to sign it. The more people we can get to sign that open letter as possible, the better, to really make sure that the Minister can listen to the needs of family carers supporting somebody with dementia. So finally, that's thank you so much for joining us, and I'll say goodbye, and I'll leave Raja to say goodbye.
I think this session is a kind of a prelude to the positive behavior support plan, which kind of expands on some of the things that we've discussed today. And Lizzie is very good, and I'm sure people who are attending this would find it very helpful. Equally, I also wanted to thank all those people who came to watch cricket when we organized our first Dementia Aware Cricket Day at Lord's, and we've got the next day coming up on the 20th of September. So hopefully I could see more of you there, and it'll be a great day.
Great. Thanks. And we'll be, thank you, Raja. We'll be putting more details about that event on the website, on our Facebook posts and so on. And as you say, it was a great event. I was there. It was fantastic to see family members and people with dementia reminiscing around a sport that they loved so much, and really promoting the well-being of both. So thank you for flagging that one. So thank you everyone for your patience today, and we'll see you at the next Facebook Live. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.